A dream denied. Jordan Pierce's love for basketball was woven into the very fabric of his life. He was just a boy when he first picked up a basketball, but even then, he had a spark in his eye. His mother had always said that Jordan's energy wasn't something you could ignore. Every afternoon, as soon as school let out, Jordan would rush home, his backpack discarded in the hallway, and head straight for the weathered basketball hoop that his mother had set up in their driveway. The hoop wasn't anything special, its backboard was cracked, and the net had long since been replaced with a frayed piece of string, but to Jordan, it was a symbol of what could be. It was where his dreams began. He'd shoot for hours, honing his skills, trying to perfect the way the ball left his fingertips. The sound of the ball bouncing on the cracked pavement became his rhythm, his heartbeat. He knew he wasn't the tallest kid, nor the fastest, but that didn't matter to him. He had heart, and he had determination. That was all he needed to make it. "Nice shot, honey." His mother's voice would call from the porch. She was always there, watching him, even when she was busy with the never-ending list of chores. Whether she was folding laundry or cleaning the house, she would make sure to cheer him on. Her words were more than encouragement, they were the fuel he needed to keep going. Jordan didn't just practice for the sake of it. Each shot, each dribble, was part of a bigger dream, a dream of one day playing for a major college, and maybe even in the NBA. But it wasn't an easy dream. Not for someone like Jordan. He had to fight for every opportunity, prove himself time and time again. And when he was 16, the chance came, high school basketball tryouts. Jordan had worked harder than he ever had for this moment. He had spent countless hours refining his jump shot, learning to read the game, and building his stamina. He knew what was at stake. The high school team wasn't just an after-school hobby, it was his shot at getting noticed. His shot at a future beyond what his small town could offer. The gymnasium was packed with hopefuls, all eager to earn a spot on the team. Jordan wasn't intimidated by the crowd, though. In his mind, it was just another game, just another opportunity to show what he was made of. The whistle blew, signaling the start of the tryouts. Jordan took to the court, his sneakers squeaking against the hardwood. He dribbled with confidence, maneuvering around defenders, making crisp passes, and sinking shots from all over the court. But there was one thing Jordan couldn't ignore, the presence of Coach Randall. The man was a figure of authority, a man whose reputation preceded him. Coach Randall was known for one thing above all else, his ability to pick the best players. He didn't care about the backstory or the struggle, he only cared about what was on the court. And right now, Jordan felt as though he was being judged by more than just his skills. He was being judged by his size, by the color of his skin, by things he couldn't change. Jordan pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on his game. His eyes locked on the basket as he took shot after shot. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. He played with passion, with fire, with everything he had inside of him. But at the end of the day, it wasn't enough. When Coach Randall finally made the announcement, Jordan's heart was in his throat. He knew what was coming. Coach Randall's eyes scanned the list of names, his gaze cold and analytical. He called out players' names one by one, each announcement met with cheers and high fives. But when Jordan's name wasn't called, a cold wave of disappointment washed over him. Coach Randall's voice cut through the tension. "Jordan Pierce. You're a good player, but you don't have what it takes to make the team. You're too small. You need more than just effort to play at this level." The words hit Jordan like a punch to the gut. He had heard criticism before, but this time, it wasn't just about his game, it was about his entire being. Coach Randall wasn't just telling him that he wasn't good enough for the team, he was telling him that his size, his background, his very essence wasn't enough. Jordan felt the sting of rejection deep in his bones. He stood there, frozen, as the others celebrated around him. His world suddenly felt smaller, as though the dream he'd worked so hard for had just slipped through his fingers. He walked off the court slowly, trying to keep his composure. His head was low, his shoulders heavy with the weight of disappointment. His mother had always told him to keep going, to never give up, but in that moment, Jordan wondered if it was all just a fantasy. If no matter how hard he tried, people like Coach Randall would always see him as less. As he made his way out of the gym, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of betrayal. He hadn't just been cut from the team. He had been made to feel invisible. To Coach Randall, Jordan was just another kid who wasn't good enough. But to Jordan, it was more than that. It was a message: no matter how hard you try, no matter how much you give, there are always people who will see you as less than what you are. The next few days passed in a blur. Jordan's mind kept replaying Coach Randall's words, each repetition driving the pain deeper. He could barely concentrate at school, his thoughts constantly returning to basketball and the sting of rejection. He kept telling himself that he needed to keep working, that he needed to prove Coach Randall wrong. But even as he thought these things, doubts began to creep in. His mother noticed the change in him. She saw the frustration in his eyes and the way he avoided the court. One evening, she found him sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the old basketball in his hands. The look on his face broke her heart. "Jordan," she said softly, sitting down beside him. "I know you're hurt right now. I can see it. But listen to me. One person's opinion doesn't define who you are. You are more than this game, more than the rejection. You have something that no one can take from you, your heart, your passion. Don't let anyone take that from you." Jordan looked at his mother, the words sinking deep into his soul. She was right, of course. He couldn't let Coach Randall's dismissal define him. He couldn't let one person's narrow-minded view of him stand in the way of everything he dreamed of. But the question remained: how could he prove that he was more than what Coach Randall had seen? How could he show the world that he wasn't just a small, overlooked player but a force to be reckoned with? The answer came to him slowly, through the pain, through the doubt. It came through the understanding that no one was going to hand him his dream. If he wanted it, he would have to take it. And so, he did. Jordan got back on the court, day after day, practicing with even more intensity, more focus. This wasn't just about basketball anymore, it was about showing the world that he was worthy, that he was more than they thought. And that was just the beginning. The fire inside him had been lit, and nothing was going to extinguish it. Fueling the fire. The days following the rejection from Coach Randall were the darkest Jordan had experienced in his young life. He could still hear the coach's dismissive words echoing in his head, and it felt like a weight on his chest that refused to lift. But as the weeks passed, something shifted within him. The rejection, though painful, began to evolve from a wound into fuel. Every time he heard Randall's voice in his head, it only made him push harder. The anger, the frustration, it all became part of his drive. Jordan Pierce was not going to be forgotten. He was going to be a force to be reckoned with. Jordan's mother, seeing the fire rekindled in her son's heart, tried to keep his spirits up. She encouraged him, supported him, and never doubted his ability to rise above the setback. "Remember, baby," she'd say, "it's not about what others think of you. It's about what you believe you can do. You've got this." And Jordan did have it. He was more determined than ever before. He started spending every free moment he had on the court, regardless of how exhausted he was from school or other responsibilities. The weather didn't matter, and neither did the time of day. The court was his sanctuary. There, he was free to work on his game, to push himself to his limits, to get better. He spent countless hours shooting jump shots, perfecting his form, working on his dribbling, and increasing his endurance. Even when his body screamed for rest, Jordan pushed through. The pain of rejection had ignited something deep within him, and he wasn't going to let it extinguish. While his friends spent their weekends hanging out and enjoying the fleeting freedom of youth, Jordan was on the court, his only company the basketball and the distant hum of his mom's laundry machine. The faded hoop that once represented the beginning of his dreams now stood as a symbol of his resolve. Each time he made a shot, the joy of the swish was bittersweet. It wasn't just a triumph over the hoop, but over the doubts that had tried to consume him. Months passed, and Jordan's dedication began to bear fruit. He started playing in neighborhood games with older kids, guys who had more experience, more skill, and certainly more size. They weren't afraid to push him around, to test his limits. Jordan took every challenge head-on. If they boxed him out, he found a way around it. If they mocked his small frame, he proved that heart and speed could overcome any disadvantage. Each game, no matter the outcome, made him better. One day, during a particularly tough game against some local high school players, Jordan found himself matched up against a lanky, fast player who seemed to have the upper hand. For the first few minutes, it seemed as though Jordan's opponent was unbeatable. The guy was quick, and every time Jordan thought he had the ball, it was gone in an instant. But Jordan didn't back down. He refused to let his frustration show. He kept moving, kept pressing, and kept thinking. Slowly but surely, Jordan started reading his opponent's movements, predicting the angles, cutting off the passing lanes, and using his smaller frame to get around him. By the end of the game, Jordan had scored more than anyone else on the court, and his opponent's frustration was evident. Jordan couldn't help but smile to himself. He wasn't just growing as a player, he was becoming a strategist, a tactician, someone who could outthink his opponents just as much as he could outplay them. His body was learning to move with grace, with purpose, and with a fluidity that no one could ignore. But the growth wasn't just physical. Every dribble, every pass, every move on the court had become a mental exercise. Jordan's confidence was building with each game, and with it, his ability to block out the noise, the doubt, the mockery, the rejections of the past. Basketball had become more than a game to him, it was his language, his expression. Each time he played, he felt the sting of Coach Randall's rejection fade just a little more. The harder Jordan worked, the more his reputation began to spread. At school, his name started to circulate in whispers. "Did you see Pierce play yesterday? Man, that kid's got game." He wasn't just the quiet kid in the back of the class anymore, he was Jordan Pierce, the kid who could outplay anyone on the court. The buzz was slow at first, but it was building. By the time the next school year rolled around, Jordan was a completely different player. He had grown, both physically and mentally. He wasn't just a kid with heart anymore, he was a force. It wasn't just his shooting that had improved, it was everything. His ball handling was smoother, his defense was impenetrable, and his court vision was sharper than ever before. He had become an unstoppable presence on the court. The school basketball team had tryouts again, but this time, Jordan wasn't nervous. He knew what he was capable of. The days leading up to tryouts, he continued to work tirelessly on his game, knowing that this time would be different. This time, he would be the one picked. When tryouts arrived, the gym was packed with eager athletes, just like the year before. But this time, Jordan stood tall, his back straight, his face focused. Coach Randall was standing at the side, clipboard in hand, scanning the court with a critical eye. Jordan didn't look at him, he didn't need to. He wasn't there to impress anyone but himself. The drills began, and Jordan attacked each one with an intensity that left no room for doubt. His jump shot was flawless, his footwork precise, his hustle unmatched. It wasn't about doing flashy tricks or showing off. It was about showing that he had put in the work, that he had earned his spot. And this time, Coach Randall noticed. Throughout the tryouts, Jordan didn't focus on the coach. He didn't care whether Coach Randall was watching him closely or not. He knew he was the best player in the gym. He was playing for the future, not for the approval of one man, but for the respect of everyone who had ever doubted him. When the final cuts were made, the team was announced. Jordan's name was called loud and clear, and this time, there was no doubt. He had earned his place. It wasn't a fluke, it was the result of years of hard work, of sacrifice, of determination. As Jordan walked out onto the court for his first official practice, he couldn't help but look up at the stands. His mom was there, sitting in her usual spot, smiling proudly at him. Her encouragement had been the constant that had carried him through, and now, with his name on the roster, he knew it had all been worth it. Coach Randall, standing off to the side, watched as Jordan took his place on the court. The coach's face was unreadable, but Jordan could sense something in his gaze. Perhaps it was admiration, or maybe it was regret. It didn't matter. Jordan had already moved past the coach's doubts. This was his time. The road ahead was long, but Jordan was no longer the same kid who had been cut from the team all those years ago. He was a new player, and he wasn't just going to make an impact, he was going to change the game. Rising above. As Jordan entered his junior year of high school, everything was changing. He wasn't just another player on the team anymore. His reputation was solidifying, and with every game, every practice, every minute on the court, he proved that he belonged. The coaching staff was impressed, and his teammates began to recognize him not just as a skilled player, but as a leader. Jordan had come a long way from the kid who was told he didn't have what it took. Now, he was the one who set the tempo, who motivated others, and who showed up when it counted. The gymnasium, once filled with doubt and rejection, now echoed with the sound of Jordan's ball bouncing, his sneakers squeaking across the polished hardwood. His form was flawless, his footwork crisp, and his intensity unmatched. He wasn't the tallest, nor the most physically imposing, but what Jordan had was something that could not be measured in inches or pounds. He had heart, a boundless, unwavering passion for the game, a belief in himself that could not be broken. His mom, as always, was there for every practice, every game, offering her quiet support from the stands. She knew what her son had gone through, what he had overcome, and it filled her with pride to see him now. But she also knew this wasn't the end. Jordan's journey was far from over. The team had a new energy with Jordan as the focal point. His presence on the court changed everything. Where there was once hesitation, there was now confidence. His teammates fed off his energy, and soon, the high school team was winning games they previously would have lost. Jordan had become the leader they never expected but always needed. As the season progressed, word began to spread about Jordan. Opposing coaches whispered about his talent, his tenacity, and his drive. Scouts from colleges started showing up at games, intrigued by the young player who seemed destined for greatness. But no matter how much attention he received, Jordan kept his focus on the task at hand, winning for his team, showing them that together, they could do anything. It wasn't all smooth sailing. Jordan faced challenges, both on and off the court, that threatened to shake his resolve. During a critical game midway through the season, Jordan injured his ankle. The pain was excruciating, and for a moment, it felt like everything might slip away. The thought of sitting on the sidelines, watching his teammates play without him, was almost unbearable. But in that moment of weakness, Jordan did what he had always done, he pushed through. The doctor said he needed to rest, to sit out for a few weeks, but Jordan refused. The next game, with his ankle taped and swollen, he hobbled back onto the court. He couldn't afford to sit out. Not now. Not when everything he'd worked for was so close. He played through the pain, proving not only to his teammates but also to himself that his determination could conquer any obstacle. His performance that night wasn't perfect, his movements were slower, his shots weren't as sharp, and his defense was more cautious, but he gave everything he had. And his team, inspired by his heart, rallied around him. They won that game by a slim margin, but it was the kind of win that would define their season. It was a win that showed them all that when Jordan was on the court, anything was possible. As the season neared its end, Jordan's team secured a spot in the state playoffs. It was an achievement that few believed was possible at the beginning of the year, but now, with Jordan leading the way, they were one of the top teams in the state. He had come from the bottom, from a place of doubt and rejection, and now he was on the verge of achieving something even greater. But even as his team began to rise through the ranks, Jordan's mind kept returning to one thing: Coach Randall. The coach who had cut him from the team all those years ago, who had told him he didn't have what it took. Jordan knew that there was a possibility, no, a certainty, that he and Coach Randall would meet again. The thought of facing the man who had once doubted him made Jordan's heart beat faster, but it wasn't out of fear. It was out of anticipation. He wasn't the same person he had been back then. He wasn't the boy who had been told to leave. Now, he was a player who had earned every ounce of respect he'd received. The path to the championship wasn't easy. Every team they faced in the playoffs had been tough, each game more grueling than the last. But with each victory, Jordan's confidence grew, as did the belief in his teammates. They had come together as a unit, a team that was as much a family as it was a squad of players. And at the center of it all was Jordan, who had shown them that with hard work and determination, anything was possible. But there was one more obstacle to overcome before they could reach the ultimate prize: the national championship game. The moment that Jordan had dreamed of for years, the moment he would finally have the chance to prove not only to Coach Randall but to the entire world that he was more than just a small, overlooked player. The day of the championship arrived, and with it came the pressure. The gymnasium was filled with energy, the stands packed with fans, the air thick with anticipation. As Jordan suited up, he couldn't help but think back to everything that had led him to this point. He thought of the countless hours spent practicing in his driveway, the countless days he'd spent proving that he belonged. And now, it was all coming down to this one game. The opposing team, the reigning champions, was formidable. They had size, strength, and a history of winning. But Jordan knew that the game wasn't about who had the biggest players or the flashiest moves, it was about who had the heart, who had the will to win. And Jordan knew that no one had more heart than he did. When the game began, it was everything Jordan had imagined and more. The pace was fast, the pressure immense, but Jordan thrived under it. His movements were precise, his passes sharp, his shots nothing short of spectacular. But it wasn't just his individual performance that made the difference, it was his leadership. Every time his team faltered, every time they needed a reminder of what was at stake, Jordan was there to lift them up. His voice, his energy, and his belief in them were as important as anything he could do on the court. By the fourth quarter, the game was tied, and it was anyone's game. The tension in the gym was palpable, the crowd on the edge of their seats. But Jordan wasn't scared. He had faced adversity before, and he knew this moment was just another challenge he had to overcome. With just seconds left on the clock, the ball was in his hands. He looked up at the hoop, took a deep breath, and dribbled past his defender. As he neared the three-point line, he could see Coach Randall on the sideline, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the game. Jordan didn't look at him long, but the sight of the coach, who had once rejected him, was all the motivation he needed. In that split second, Jordan made his move. With one swift motion, he launched the ball into the air. Time seemed to freeze as the ball sailed toward the hoop. The world held its breath. And then, swish. The buzzer sounded, and Jordan's team erupted in celebration. They had won the national championship. Jordan stood there, breathless, his heart pounding. He had done it. He had overcome every obstacle, every rejection, and every doubt. And now, with the championship in his hands, he had proven that his heart, his passion, and his determination were all he ever needed. But even as the crowd roared, Jordan's eyes found Coach Randall. For a moment, there was a stillness between them, an unspoken understanding. Coach Randall, for the first time, saw Jordan not as a small, overlooked player, but as the champion he had always been. As Jordan made his way off the court, his teammates surrounding him in celebration, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. It wasn't about rubbing his victory in Coach Randall's face, it was about the journey. About proving to himself, and to everyone who had ever doubted him, that he was more than they had ever imagined. And in that moment, Jordan Pierce knew that his story had only just begun. The weight of victory. The trophy was heavy in Jordan's hands, its golden surface gleaming under the arena lights. His teammates surrounded him, their faces flushed with joy and exhaustion, their voices a blur of laughter and celebration. The stadium had erupted into cheers moments before, the crowd still buzzing with excitement, but for Jordan, the noise felt distant. He had always been a driven player, always focused on the next move, the next game, the next goal. But now, in the silence of the moment, standing with the national championship trophy in his grasp, Jordan allowed himself to savor the feeling. The journey, the sweat, the sacrifices, it was all worth it. He had worked tirelessly, clawing his way from the rejection he had suffered years ago to this very moment. As he looked around at his teammates, he saw the culmination of their hard work as well. They had fought side by side, trusting one another and believing in each other. It was a team effort, no doubt, but Jordan knew that this was also a victory for himself, a personal triumph over the doubts and limitations that had been placed on him. His mother, as always, was there, her eyes bright with pride as she stood near the sideline, waiting for the moment when she could rush into his arms. When he finally made his way over to her, she pulled him into a tight hug. The smell of her perfume, the warmth of her embrace, these were the things that had never wavered, no matter how much the world changed around him. "I'm so proud of you, Jordan," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You did it. You proved them all wrong." Jordan smiled, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We did it, Mom. We all did it." As the celebrations continued around him, Jordan found himself stepping away, walking towards the far end of the court. He needed a moment alone. He had worked so hard for this victory, but now, with the championship secured, something inside him began to shift. It wasn't that he wasn't happy, he was thrilled, elated even, but there was a sense of something unfinished. It wasn't about the trophy. It wasn't even about winning the game. It was about proving something to himself and to others, and now, he wasn't sure what to do with all the emotions that flooded him. He glanced up at the scoreboard one more time, the numbers now final, and took a deep breath. It wasn't the first time he had stood here, on a court like this, fighting for his place. He had walked this path before, in a different gym, with a different team. But this time, it felt different. There was a weight to the victory, a weight that came not just from the physical exertion of winning, but from the realization that this moment had been years in the making. Every early morning practice, every late-night game, every sacrifice he had made had led him here. The victory wasn't just his, it belonged to everyone who had believed in him, from his mom to his teammates to the people who had supported him even when he was at his lowest. But there was still one piece of this puzzle that hadn't been resolved. As the team's coach made his way towards Jordan to congratulate him, Jordan's eyes scanned the arena, searching for a familiar face. His heart skipped when he spotted Coach Randall across the court, speaking with another coach. For years, Jordan had lived with the knowledge that Coach Randall had underestimated him. Every drill, every practice, every win had been done with that thought in the back of his mind. And now, standing with the championship trophy in his hands, Jordan couldn't ignore the part of him that wanted some kind of acknowledgement. Not from his teammates, not from the fans, but from the man who had once rejected him, the man who had told him he didn't have what it took. Jordan walked across the court, his footsteps measured and purposeful. The noise of the celebration seemed to fade into the background as he made his way toward the coach. As he approached Randall, the older man glanced up and met his gaze. For a brief moment, the world seemed to stop. Time slowed, and Jordan could feel the weight of their shared history, the years of silence between them. Coach Randall looked different now, older, perhaps a little worn down. There was a faint trace of regret in his eyes, but also a begrudging respect. He knew exactly who Jordan was now, knew what he had become. The question was, did Randall understand the magnitude of his past decision? Did he see the impact of his actions, of cutting Jordan from the team all those years ago? Jordan stopped in front of him, the trophy still in his hands, his expression calm but resolute. The coach stood still for a moment, his mouth opening and closing as if he didn't know what to say. Finally, he spoke. "You were always better than I gave you credit for," Coach Randall said, his voice quiet. The words hung in the air between them, almost fragile. Jordan stared at him for a moment, processing the apology that wasn't exactly an apology. It wasn't the kind of acknowledgement he had expected, but in a way, it was enough. His eyes softened, and a faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Thanks," Jordan said, his voice steady. "But I didn't need your approval then. I don't need it now." Coach Randall nodded, the weight of Jordan's words sinking in. There was no grand confrontation, no dramatic moment of vindication. Jordan had already done the hard work. He had already proven who he was, both to himself and to everyone else. The championship was the final nail in the coffin of the doubts that had haunted him. With a nod, Jordan turned away, feeling a sense of closure. The past was behind him now, and no matter what Coach Randall thought or said, he knew the truth. He had become the player he had always dreamed of being, not because of anyone's approval, but because of his own relentless will. As he rejoined his teammates, the joy of the victory washed over him once more. But now, there was peace. He had made it. He had reached the top. And the road ahead, whether it led to more championships, college basketball, or something else, was his to walk. But for the first time, Jordan didn't feel the need to rush forward. He knew that he had already proven everything he needed to. The game had taught him lessons that extended far beyond the court. And as he looked at the trophy in his hands, he realized that the real victory wasn't in the championship itself, it was in the person he had become along the way. Epilogue, a new chapter. Jordan's rise didn't stop with the national championship. The college scouts who had been watching him all season were now more than eager to offer him a spot on their teams. But Jordan wasn't in a rush. He took his time, considering each opportunity carefully. He knew that his talent would get him far, but it was his heart and mind that would shape his future. The next few years saw Jordan becoming a standout player at the college level, but more importantly, a mentor to younger players who were in the same position he had once been. He made it his mission to never let another player feel overlooked or underestimated. And as for Coach Randall? Well, he never forgot the lessons Jordan had taught him, and he reached out several years later, offering not an apology, but a simple word of congratulations. Jordan accepted it with grace, but he had already moved on, he had his own legacy to build. Victory, he realized, wasn't just about the trophies or the titles, it was about showing up for yourself, no matter what anyone else thought. And that, Jordan knew, was the greatest win of all. The road beyond. The sound of sneakers scraping against the hardwood, the relentless bounce of basketballs, and the quiet hum of the crowd, it all felt so familiar. Jordan stood at the center of the college arena, his heart pounding in his chest, feeling that same electrifying surge of energy that had first ignited his love for the game all those years ago. But now, it was different. This time, he wasn't the hopeful, uncertain kid looking for a chance. He wasn't the underdog trying to prove his worth. Jordan was a leader, a force on the court, a player others respected, and most importantly, a man who had already defied the odds. His transition from high school to college basketball had been seamless, though not without its challenges. The stakes were higher, the competition fiercer, and the spotlight brighter. But Jordan had faced pressure before. He had already fought the battle for respect, for acknowledgement, and he knew how to carry the weight of expectation on his shoulders. College basketball was the next step, but it didn't feel like the end. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something even greater. During his first season at college, Jordan was thrown into the fire. He quickly became a starter, playing in nearly every game, and his performance never wavered. He put in the hours in the gym, practicing his dribbling, his shooting, his defense. His work ethic, however, was his most powerful asset. His teammates soon realized that Jordan wasn't just another star player, he was a player who made those around him better. He shared his knowledge, pushed his teammates to improve, and led by example. His journey had taught him the importance of persistence, of striving for excellence not just for personal glory but for the collective success of the team. Off the court, Jordan was equally committed to his growth. He had already faced adversity, now, he sought to prepare for the future. He was determined not to let the success of basketball define him. His education became just as important as his athletic career, and he took his studies seriously. His major in communications was a reflection of his desire to tell stories, stories of overcoming obstacles, of rising above the challenges that life threw his way. He often visited schools in the area, speaking to young athletes who might be facing similar struggles he had dealt with as a kid. He shared his experiences, how rejection had shaped him, how hard work had turned his weaknesses into strengths, and how belief in oneself could break through any barrier. Jordan had become the role model he had once needed, and he took the responsibility seriously. His speeches weren't just motivational, they were raw, real, and full of the lessons he had learned the hard way. But as his college years progressed, there were moments when doubt crept in. Despite all of his achievements, the scars of his past, of being told he wasn't good enough, of Coach Randall's rejection, still lingered. It wasn't that he questioned his ability or his worth, but sometimes, in the quiet moments after a game or during long bus rides between cities, the old feelings would resurface. The fear of failure. The fear of not living up to expectations. And the thought of those who had once turned their backs on him. During one particularly tough stretch of games, when his team was struggling and the pressure was mounting, Jordan found himself facing a familiar enemy, his own mind. In the past, he had used doubt as fuel, channeling it into his performance. But now, with the stakes higher and the weight of expectations heavier, Jordan wasn't sure how much longer he could carry it all. The pressure to lead his team to a national championship, the desire to prove himself on the biggest stage, these things weighed on him. He started to question if he was enough, if he could carry the mantle for his team and himself. It was his mom who reminded him of who he truly was. One night, after a particularly tough loss, Jordan found himself in a rare moment of solitude, sitting in the quiet of his dorm room, staring at the championship trophy he had won in high school. He had moved on from that victory, but the memory of it remained etched in his mind. It was the pinnacle of his journey, a reminder that anything was possible if he believed in himself. But the doubts still lingered. His phone buzzed. It was a text from his mom. "I know you're feeling the pressure right now, but remember, you've been here before. The game is just the game. You've already won. You've already proven that you're unstoppable. Believe in that. We're all so proud of you, no matter what happens next." Those words, simple as they were, pierced through Jordan's fog of doubt. He realized something. It wasn't about the championships, the trophies, or the recognition. It was about the journey, the resilience it took to get to this point, the people who had supported him along the way, and the belief that no matter how hard things got, he would never give up. With renewed clarity, Jordan stepped onto the court the following day, determined not to let his struggles define him. The next game was crucial, a make-or-break moment for the team's playoff chances. As he warmed up, his mind was clear. His body moved with purpose, every dribble and shot a reminder that he had earned his place here. His team needed him, but more importantly, he needed himself. The game wasn't about proving anything to anyone else, it was about proving that Jordan Pierce could stand tall in the face of doubt, that he could rise above the noise and become the player and the man he knew he was destined to be. The game was intense. His opponents were fierce, pushing him to his limits, but Jordan rose to the occasion. He played with the same fire he had always carried, but this time, it was tempered with wisdom. He knew how to take control, when to step up, and when to trust his teammates. His leadership shone through in the toughest moments. When his team was down by 5 with only a few minutes left, Jordan calmed them, calling for a play that would turn the game around. With seconds on the clock, he drove to the basket, evading defenders with a quick, calculated move, and made a game-winning layup that sealed the victory. The locker room erupted with cheers as his teammates swarmed him, lifting him into the air. They had won, and it was because of his leadership. As the game clock ticked down to 0, Jordan felt the weight of his journey in the joy of his victory, but it wasn't about the score. It wasn't about the accolades. It was about the fact that, for the first time in a long time, he had fully embraced who he had become. After the game, Coach Randall was waiting for him at the sidelines. It was an encounter Jordan had anticipated for years, the moment when their paths would cross again. Coach Randall, his face weathered with age and experience, extended his hand. "I've been watching you, Jordan," he said, his voice low but full of respect. "You've become everything I could never see back then. You were right about yourself all along. I should have never doubted you." Jordan shook his hand, his heart calm but his mind racing. He didn't need the validation anymore, but hearing those words from the man who had once dismissed him felt like the final piece of the puzzle. It wasn't about revenge, it wasn't about proving anyone wrong, it was about proving to himself that he was the best version of who he could be. And in that moment, he knew that his journey was far from over. He had already overcome so much, but the path ahead was filled with even greater opportunities. The national championship would come, one way or another, but Jordan had already won the most important victory. The victory over doubt. The victory over fear. The victory over the man he once was. And with that, the next chapter of his life began, an open road, full of promise, ready for Jordan Pierce to leave his mark. Legacy in motion. As Jordan entered his final year of college basketball, the whispers of his past, the doubts, the rejections, the uphill battles, felt like distant echoes. They no longer defined him. Instead, his focus had shifted. Now, it was about what he would leave behind. His legacy was no longer tied to a single victory or championship. It was tied to the way he had transformed, the lives he had touched, and the hope he had sparked in others. Jordan had become not just a player on the court but a force for change, an inspiration in the locker room, on the streets, and in the community. His final season had been an emotional roller coaster, not because of the games, but because of what they represented. With every dribble, every pass, every dunk, Jordan was carving out a new identity. He no longer just played for himself. He played for the younger athletes who looked up to him, for the children who had faced the same discrimination he had endured, and for his family, who had always been there. But more than that, he was playing for the version of himself who had once doubted everything he was capable of. This season wasn't just for the national championship, it was for everything he had overcome. One night, as he sat on the edge of his bed in his dorm room, staring out at the city skyline, Jordan reflected on everything that had led him to this point. His thoughts often wandered back to Coach Randall. He hadn't seen the man since their last encounter after the playoff game. Jordan had moved on, but there was something about that moment, something about the way Randall had finally admitted his mistake, that lingered in his mind. It had been a brief, fleeting conversation, but it had been one of the most significant moments of his career. Jordan had always believed in forgiveness. But forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean erasing the past. The scars from his rejection still lived within him, but they no longer controlled him. He had learned to use those scars as a reminder of what he was capable of how far he had come. And in the quiet of his room, with only the sounds of his steady breathing to accompany him, Jordan realized something: forgiveness was for him, not for anyone else. It was about freeing himself from the shackles of anger, of resentment, and of the past. His reflection was interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in," Jordan called. His best friend and roommate, Marcus, poked his head into the room. "You're deep in thought again," Marcus said with a grin. He tossed a basketball onto Jordan's bed. "I'm sure you've got plenty of plans for tomorrow's practice, but we're about to go grab something to eat. You're coming, right?" Jordan smiled. "Yeah, I'll be down in a second." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You know what tomorrow is, right?" Jordan stopped for a moment, his heart skipping a beat. "The game, it's our last regular season game before the playoffs." Marcus nodded. "Yup. The scouts are all coming to watch. Your final chance to prove what you're really made of." Jordan's thoughts turned inward. He wasn't nervous about the scouts. He had long since learned to tune out the external pressures. But this game, this final game, was different. It was a reminder that the end of his college career was fast approaching. The NBA was calling. The scouts, the agents, the media, they were all circling like vultures, eager to claim the next big star. But Jordan wasn't sure if he was ready for that next chapter. He had always dreamed of playing professionally, of proving himself on the world stage. But the reality of it, the weight of the decision, made him pause. What if it was all just a new set of expectations, a new level of pressure? What if he lost himself again, as he had almost done before? "I'm not sure," Jordan admitted, his voice quiet. "I've been thinking about it, but I'm not sure what comes next. What if I don't want to be just another player in the league? What if I don't want the spotlight?" Marcus sat down beside him. "Jordan, the game has always been about you and your passion. If you love basketball, if it still excites you the way it did when you first started, you have to follow that. You don't owe anyone anything. You're not just going into the NBA to prove something to people. You're doing it for yourself. You've already proven you belong, man." Jordan nodded, but the unease lingered. The thought of being just another player in the system, of losing himself in the grind, was a daunting prospect. Yet, there was still a part of him that longed for the challenge. He had always been someone who embraced the struggle, the hard work, the fight for his place. But this was different. The world was watching him now. His every move would be analyzed, critiqued, and dissected. He couldn't escape that reality. But Marcus was right. Jordan had never played for anyone else. He had played for the love of the game, for the chance to prove to himself that he was enough, that he could rise above the doubts and make something of his life. That's why he had to continue. The next day, as Jordan laced up his sneakers and walked onto the court, the weight of the future still lingered. The energy in the arena was palpable. This was the moment. This was the final step in his college career, the last regular season game before the playoffs. It was his final chance to leave an indelible mark on his college basketball journey. And he knew, deep down, that he couldn't leave it all behind just yet. The game unfolded like a cinematic masterpiece. Every move, every shot, every pass was executed with precision and purpose. Jordan was on fire, playing the best game of his life. His team rallied around him, following his lead as he made play after play. But what stood out wasn't just his performance, it was his presence. Jordan had become more than just a player. He was a leader. His teammates fed off his energy, his confidence, his belief in them. The crowd roared with each dunk, with each moment of brilliance, and by the time the final buzzer sounded, Jordan had done it. He had led his team to a dominant victory. As the game ended, Jordan stood on the court, drenched in sweat, his heart racing. He had given everything. And for the first time, he realized that basketball wasn't just about the game. It was about the journey, the relationships he had built, the lives he had changed, and the person he had become. The victory felt sweet, but it wasn't the score on the board that mattered. It was the way the game had shaped him, the way it had allowed him to evolve and grow. But even as the crowd cheered, Jordan knew that this wasn't the end of the road. The NBA scouts had watched him closely, their eyes locked on his every move. The invitations would come soon, offers, interviews, contracts. But in that moment, Jordan didn't think about what was next. He simply took a deep breath and smiled, knowing that whatever came next, he would face it with the same resilience, the same heart, and the same unshakable belief in himself. Because no matter where his path led, Jordan knew one thing: his legacy would be defined by more than just victories. It would be defined by the impact he had on the world, the way he had inspired others, the way he had never given up, and the way he had proven, time and time again, that no dream was too big to chase. And in that truth, Jordan had found peace.